Well, welcome back. In this session, we're going to look at the topic of ventilation, which is the process of getting the gas, the inspired gas, from the air to the alveoli so that gas exchange can occur. But before we do that, I thought it would be interesting to take a brief bird's eye view of the topics that we're going to look at in the subsequent sessions. And to do that, we'll start with this nice basic model, which shows the airways of the lung here, the alveolar gas compartment, the blood gas barrier, and the capillary blood on the other side. And what we're going to be looking at this morning is ventilation, which is the movement of gas to the alveoli. This will be followed by the topic of diffusion across the blood gas barrier, as shown here. Then we're going to look at blood flow, which is the process of moving the oxygenated blood out of the lung and allowing the CO2-laden blood to come in. Then we're going to look at gas exchange, which has to do with the matching of ventilation and blood flow. We're going to follow that with a look at blood gas transport as the oxygen is carried to the periphery of the body. And blood gas transport also deals with CO2, which has important effects on acid-base balance, so we're going to deal with that topic. Next, there'll be mechanics, which is the way the forces that support and move the lung. Then we'll look at the control of ventilation, because the oxygen and CO2 levels are measured in the arterial blood and they're used to regulate the level of ventilation. Next, we'll look at defense systems, because the lung is always exposed to pollutants which are inspired, and we need to look at the way in which the lung keeps itself clean. And then we're going to look at the lung under stress, several stresses, one of which is exercise. And this is Dr. Roger Bannister breaking the first 4-minute mile barrier. And finally, we're going to look at the lung at the limit. And here we have Dr. Chris Pizzo taking alveolar gas samples on the summit of Mount Everest. So now let's turn to ventilation. And we've seen this beautiful cast of lung airways before. Very elegant, as you can see, but desperately complicated. And as we said before, how can we possibly understand what's happening in such a complicated system of airways? But fortunately, a Swiss anatomist, Dr. Weibel, sat down, as we mentioned before, one day and counted the airways in the lung and measured their sizes and so on. And he came up with an idealized model of the airways, which is to some extent an oversimplification, but nevertheless is a tremendously useful way of looking at the airways of the lung. And what he said was that there is, first of all, a conducting zone here, starting at the trachea and going all the way down to the terminal bronchioles, which are the last airways that don't contain alveoli. So all this is the dead space, the anatomic dead space, a volume about 150 mils. And then we get to the respiratory zone, or sometimes called the transitional and respiratory zone, which is where the alveolation starts. The respiratory bronchioles have a few alveoli, and then more and more occur until we get down to the alveolar sacs and the alveoli. And this is by far the largest volume of the lung, and of course is the volume concerned with gas exchange. So let's look now in more detail at some of the aspects of ventilation, and I'm going to start with one of the implications of the Weibel model, which is shown here. Now, what we've got here is the total cross-section of the airways of each generation, plotted against the airway generation itself, as you can see. And the way we get this information is, first of all, we take the trachea and we measure the cross-sectional area, and we put that point there. And then we go to the right and left main bronchi, that's the next generation. We measure the combined cross-sectional area and we put that point in, and so on. And as you can see, the result is that over the first few generations, the cross-sectional area, total cross-sectional area, doesn't change much at all until we get to the region of the respiratory zone. And there is an enormous increase in the cross-sectional area. It's a little bit like a trumpet, where you've got a long initial part and the flaring at the end of the trumpet. And this has very important implications for ventilation, for gas flow. It turns out that because of this enormous increase in cross-sectional area, the forward velocity of the gas, because of convection, becomes very small in this region of the lung. Now, what do I mean? What I'm saying is that each generation of airways has the same volume of gas going through it, of course, and that when you get to an area where a region where the cross-sectional area is very large, the forward velocity of the gas by convection becomes very small. By convection, I mean the normal flow of a gas or a liquid, like pouring beer out of a pitcher, for example, as an example of convection. So what happens when we get to this respiratory zone and the forward velocity of the gas through convection becomes extremely low? It turns out that another mechanism of gas transfer takes over, and this is diffusion. Diffusion in the gas phase is responsible for most of the movement of the gas in the respiratory zone. Diffusion means the random movement of molecules being bombarded by other molecules around them, and this is the way the gas moves from the predominant way in which it moves from the terminal bronchioles to the peripheral alveoli. Now, this has important implications in lung disease because it turns out that most of the pollutants therefore deposit in this junction here between the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. The reason is that pollutants are small particles, or aerosols as we call them, like tobacco smoke, for example. And what happens is that when the pollutants get to this region of the lung, the respiratory zone, their diffusion rate is extremely small. Although they're small particles, they're much more massive than the molecules of air. And for that reason, they're unable to traverse this region from the junction of the conducting zone and the respiratory zone to the peripheral alveoli. And a nice example of this is shown in this image here. Here we have the deposit of dust in a coal miner's lung. So a lung looked at autopsy, and you may not be able to recognize what's happening here. What we've got is a terminal bronchiole coming in. We've got the respiratory bronchioles here, and the edge of the acinus is around here. I can see it, but it's not easy for someone who's not familiar with these things to see it. And so the artist has put in a cartoon at the top to show us what's happening. And as you can see, the dust is found in the immediate vicinity of the terminal and respiratory bronchioles. The peripheral alveoli are completely spared of dust. And the reason for this, as I said before, is that the dust of the coal dust is sufficiently massive that it can't diffuse peripherally here, and so it deposits in this region. And that's very important because we believe that in bronchitis, inflammation of the airways, the first changes take place in these small airways here, and this is because of the deposition of the pollutants. Incidentally, I should just mention here as a caution that the fact that we find the dust here doesn't mean that it hasn't been transported to some extent from elsewhere, but nevertheless, we know this is the region where the dust is deposited. Well, now let's look at some of the volumes and flows in the lung. And again, we're going to start with our simple model with the conducting airways here, the alveolar gas, the blood gas barrier, and the capillary here. And here we've added the ventilation and the blood flow, the ventilation coming in here and the blood flow coming in here. And as I mentioned earlier on, I like to think of the lung as a symmetrical structure with ventilation on one side of the blood gas barrier and blood flow on the other. And here are some typical volumes of the lung. First of all, we've got the tidal volume. That's the volume of each breath. And that is approximately 500 ml. Now, of course, there's a good deal of variation around this, but that's a good ballpark figure, 500 ml for the tidal volume. But of course, not all of that tidal volume gets into the alveolar gas compartment. Some of it remains behind in the anatomic dead space. In fact, 150 ml does. But the volume of the alveolar gas, of course, is enormous. In this example, which another ballpark figure, about 3,000 mils, about 3 liters. So, as you might expect, the largest volume of gas in the lung is in the gas exchanging region. Now, when we go across the blood-gas barrier, we're in for a surprise because the volume of blood in the pulmonary capillaries is only about 70 ml. So there's a big disparity between the volume of gas in the lung undergoing gas exchange at any instant and the volume of blood. And that shouldn't actually surprise us all that much, because you remember when we saw a cross-section of alveoli with their capillaries, what we saw was mostly gas. Here's the alveolar gas, here's the blood, and obviously the volume of the blood is very much less than the volume of the gas. And this has to do, incidentally, with the fact that diffusion rates in the gas phase are much faster than diffusion rates in the liquid phase here. Now, when we come to look at the volumes per unit time, or the ventilations, we see that the figures on the right here. Now, let's assume that the frequency of breathing is, say, 15 breaths per minute. Again, of course, another ballpark figure, but it's approximately the correct value. So if the tidal volume is 500 ml, the frequency is 15 breaths per minute, that means the total ventilation in this particular example is 7,500 mils per minute. But of course, not all of that gas gets to the gas exchanging regions of the lung. Some of it is left behind in the dead space. So the amount of fresh gas that gets to the gas exchanging regions per minute is going to be the tidal volume less the anatomic dead space, 500 less 150, 350 ml, times the frequency of 15, which gives us an alveolar ventilation in this example of 5250 mils per minute. This is by far the most important number on this scheme here, because the alveolar ventilation is critically important. It's the amount of fresh gas getting to the alveoli per minute, and a very important variable. Now, what about the amount of blood getting to the blood-gas barrier every minute? Well, of course, that's the cardiac output. The whole of the output of the right heart goes through the pulmonary artery to the pulmonary capillaries. And the cardiac output is of the order of 5,000 mils per minute, 5 or 6 liters a minute, something like this. So now we see an interesting thing. In spite of the disparity between the volumes of the alveolar gas and the capillary blood at any instant in time, the volumes reaching the blood-gas barrier per minute on the gas side and the blood side are approximately the same. In other words, the ratio of alveolar ventilation to pulmonary blood flow is about 1. And we're going to hear much more about the ventilation perfusion ratio in due course. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about measuring the lung volumes with a spirometer, which is frequently done in the pulmonary function laboratory. A spirometer is simply an upturned bell, shown here, usually made of light metal, like aluminum, for example. It's immersed in water, as you can see, and there's a tube that connects the interior of the spirometer to the subject. As the subject breathes out, the spirometer goes up, the pen goes down. As the subject breathes in, the spirometer bell comes down, and the pen goes up. So here we have somebody breathing normally here. This is normal breathing, and these are the tidal volumes. There's the tidal volume here. And as we saw before, it's around about ½ liter. And then at this point, the subject is asked to take a full inspiration, go up as far as he can, increase the volume in the lung as far as he can, and the volume in the lung then is what's called the total lung capacity, as you can see. And then at this point, the subject is asked to breathe out as far as he can. And he breathes out all the way down to what we call the residual volume. In other words, he's not able to expel all the gas from his lung. There's always some left in the lung, even after a maximal expiration. And this is called the residual volume. And you could also see that the volume at the end of a normal expiration here is, of course, larger than the residual volume, and is called the functional residual capacity. Okay? The volume that the subject breathes out with this maneuver from total inspiration to total expiration is called the vital capacity. So it's clear that we can measure several volumes with a spirometer. We can measure the tidal volume, for example, and we can measure the vital capacity, but we can't measure the residual volume, the functional residual capacity or the total lung capacity, because we can't measure the volume of gas in the lung at the end of a full expiration. Now, just for a little light relief, I want to show you a picture of John Hutchinson, who developed the spirometer in about 1850, something like this. And this is a picture from his original paper. And you can see this well-dressed gentleman breathing into a spirometer. And wouldn't it be nice if all of us dressed as nicely as John Hutchinson did? So going back then to the spirometer measurements, how are we going to measure these other volumes? We can't measure them with a spirometer. How are we going to measure the functional residual capacity? Because often we want to know that. And one way of doing that is what we call helium dilution. To do this, we take a spirometer and we put a relatively small concentration, say 5%, something like that, of helium in it. Now, why helium? Because helium is a very insoluble gas, so that when the subject breathes helium, almost none of it, essentially none of it, is taken up by the blood. So we start with a given concentration, C1 of helium in the spirometer. We know the volume of the spirometer, which we call V1, and the tap is closed at this point, and the subject is breathing through a valve box, and so he's not breathing from the spirometer. But then we open the tap, and he starts to breathe from the spirometer. And we allow him to do this until there's equilibration of the helium concentration between the spirometer and the alveolar gas. And he starts to do this at FRC, functional residual capacity. And we wait until the helium is equilibrated, evenly distributed. During that period, incidentally, we add oxygen to make up for the fact that he's consuming oxygen, and we also absorb the CO2 that he produces, so we keep the volume of the spirometer constant. And at the end of the equilibration period, we write a simple equation. We say that because no helium was lost, then the concentration times the volume that we started with here is going to be the concentration that we finish with times the initial volume, V1, plus the volume of the lung. And since he was turned in to the circuit when he was at the end of a normal expiration, that's functional residual capacity, we can easily derive the FRC from this equation. So that's a relatively simple measurement to do. It used to be used a great deal. It's not used quite so much now because we have a different method, another method of measuring these lung volumes, and I'm going to talk about it now. It's more complicated, at least to explain, but it's actually simpler for the subject to do. And that is the technique using a body box, or to give it a fancy name, the plethysmograph. The body box is simply a box, an airtight box, rather like an old telephone booth. And the subject sits inside that, and we measure the pressure inside the box with a sensitive manometer. Now, we're showing it here with a water manometer, but we don't use that. We use an electronic manometer because that gives us we need that kind of accuracy, sensitivity. And so what happens is as follows. The subject has his airway occluded. We turn a tap in the airway, and he tries to inspire against a closed airway. Now, of course, he can't get a lot of gas into his lung, but he can get some by rarefying the gas, and so there's a small increase in volume of the lung. As a result of this small increase in volume, the volume of gas in the box decreases, and therefore its pressure increases. Now, here we're using Boyle's law. I don't know how many of you remember Robert Boyle from about 1650, but Robert Boyle said that if you've got a volume of gas, pressure times volume is a constant at constant temperature. That's Boyle's law, and that's what we're using here. And so what we say for the box in this initial measurement, when the subject makes an inspiratory effort, is the initial pressure and volume, P1 V1, is equal to P2, which is the pressure after he made the inspiratory maneuver, times V1 minus delta V, the original volume, which has been reduced by the volume that the lung changed, delta V. And from that, we, of course, can derive delta V. Now we apply Boyle's law to the gas in the lung, and we measure the pressure in the airway when the subject makes this attempted inspiration against a closed airway. And we start with a pressure P3, and he's at FRC when he makes this attempted inspiration. After he's made the inspiration, attempted inspiration, we've got a pressure P4, and now the volume is the FRC plus delta V. Well, we know delta V from the original set of measurements, so we plug delta V into here. It's the only unknown, so we can calculate the FRC. Now that's a little bit complicated, and I'm sure some of you will want to sit down later on and work through it yourself, because it maybe is a little bit complicated, but it's basically an application of Boyle's law to two situations. First, the air, the gas in the plethysmograph, and secondly, the gas in the lung. This, incidentally, is a method that's used very extensively, because although it looks rather complicated for us, for the subject it's very simple. The subject simply sits in the box and makes this respiratory maneuver. As a matter of fact, he doesn't just make an attempted inspiration, he pants against a closed airway, inspiration, expiration, attempted inspiration, expiration, and it's rather simple, and the device simply reads off the functional residual capacity. A very elegant device. Incidentally, it turns out sometimes that the measurements made by helium dilution and with the plethysmograph are different. Of course, in normal subjects, as you might expect, they're the same. But in some patients with lung disease, they're different. And the reason is that the plethysmograph measures the total volume of gas in the lung, whereas the helium dilution only measures the volume of gas which communicates with the mouth. And sometimes these are different in a patient with lung disease. Sometimes there are obstructed airways, and therefore the helium dilution gives a smaller volume than the plethysmograph does. So that's sometimes useful information in patients with lung disease. Okay, now let's turn to the measurement of ventilation. And first of all, we can think about measuring the total ventilation. Well, that's very easily done. We simply connect a subject to a valve box. A valve box is simply a device that separates the inspired and the expired gas, and we collect the expired gas over a given time, say 5 minutes or so, collect it in a big bag, then we measure the volume in the bag and we know the time that we've measured, and so we get the total ventilation in liters per minute. That's a relatively simple thing to do. But total ventilation is not a particularly useful measurement. What we really need to know is the alveolar ventilation, and that is more difficult to measure. And I'm going to tell you about two methods of measuring that now. The first method is to exploit the fact that the tidal volume here is made up of two sources. You've got the dead space gas, part of the expired gas here in the tidal volume comes from the dead space, and the other part comes from the alveoli. And so we can say that the total ventilation is equal to the dead space ventilation plus the alveolar ventilation. And let's show how we can do that using symbols. And now tighten your seatbelt, because you haven't seen these symbols before, and initially they may be rather daunting, but they're not really. So what we're showing here is the way we can measure alveolar ventilation by subtracting the dead space ventilation from the total ventilation. And what we're saying is that V, the volume, V stands for volume, sub T means tidal. So this is tidal volume, this is dead space volume, and this is the volume coming from the alveoli. And incidentally, as we go on, you'll see that in the gas phase, we also always use uppercase letters to indicate the gas phase here. We use lowercase for the blood phase, which we'll be talking about next time. So having set up this equation, the tidal volume is equal to the volume coming from the dead space plus the volume coming from the alveoli. We could multiply each term by the respiratory frequency, N, number of breaths per minute, and that gives us the fact that the Vt times N, which is the total ventilation, which we conventionally indicate as V dot E, E meaning expired, that's just a convention, V dot meaning volume per unit time. And those of you who can remember back at your calculus may remember that sometimes dV by dt, the volume per unit time, is indicated by a dot over the V. It's one of the conventions. So that's the convention we're using here. V dot E is volume per unit time. So that's the total ventilation is equal to the dead space ventilation, the ventilation of the dead space, plus the ventilation coming from the alveoli. Well, we simply rearrange that, and that gives us the alveolar ventilation, an equation for alveolar ventilation. Now you may say that looks like a very simple thing to do, and it is, except that it's not so easy to measure the volume of the dead space. The volume of the dead space actually doesn't change all that much, and you can predict it reasonably well sometimes, but even so, it's somewhat messy to assume that. And we have another method of measuring alveolar ventilation, which is extremely important, although a little bit complicated at first. And let me introduce it this way. This shows the same diagram as we had before, but it makes a slightly different point. The point it makes is that all of the CO2 in the expired gas comes from the alveolar compartment, okay? As we said before, the volume of the tidal volume, the expired tidal volume, comes both from the dead space and from the alveolar compartment. But of course the dead space doesn't contain any CO2. You may say, why? Well, because the dead space contains the inspired gas from the previous breath left behind in the dead space. There are no alveoli in the dead space, no gas exchange. Indeed, that's why it's called dead. And so there's no CO2 here. So all the CO2 in the expired alveolar gas comes from the alveolar compartment. And that allows us to set up an equation, again, tighten your seatbelt a bit, allows us to set up an equation here. And what we're saying is all the expired CO2 comes from the alveolar gas. So the volume of CO2 per minute exhaled, V dot CO2, volume per unit time, is equal to the alveolar ventilation times the percentage concentration of CO2 in the expired gas. In other words, if you've got 5% CO2, only 5% of the molecules of CO2 are coming from the alveolar gas. So what you can do then is instead of using a percentage concentration of CO2, we can use what's called the fractional concentration. Now, all the percentage concentrations add up to 100, the fractional concentrations add up to 1. And so if we've got, say, 5% CO2, the fractional concentration is 5 over 100 or 0.05. So all the fractional concentrations add up to 1, percentage ones add up to 100. And therefore, we can write the equation that the CO2 produced is equal to the alveolar ventilation times the fractional concentration of CO2, okay? Now it turns out, and here I have to go ahead a bit because we haven't covered this yet, we're going to cover it in the next lecture, the partial pressure of CO2, and you'll have to just take it from me for the moment. The partial pressure of CO2 is equal to the fractional concentration times a constant. In other words, the partial pressure is proportional to the fractional concentration. And we don't need to worry too much about this constant K. But this allows us to put in, instead of fractional concentration, we insert PCO2, or PCO2 over K for fractional concentration, and that gives us the final equation, which is called the alveolar ventilation equation. It's desperately important. We're going to be using it extensively in the following lectures. And what it says is that the alveolar ventilation is equal to the CO2 production divided by the PCO2. Now here we're showing it as the PCO2 in the alveolar gas. But it turns out that in normal subjects, the PCO2 of the arterial blood is the same as the alveolar gas. And believe it or not, it's not all that difficult to measure the PCO2 in arterial blood. It's done all the time. So this turns out to be a very important equation in the subsequent work we're going to be doing on gas exchange. You can see, for example, that if the CO2 production is normal, which it generally is, then the alveolar ventilation and the PCO2 are inversely related. In other words, if we double the alveolar ventilation, the PCO2 is halved. If we halve the alveolar ventilation, the PCO2 is doubled. And this alveolar ventilation equation, as it's called, is an extremely important equation, and we're going to be using it extensively in our later work. So let me now summarize what we've been talking about up to date. We're going to just be talking to look over the important points. First of all, we looked again at the complex geometry of the airways in the lung. We had a cast of the airways, and we despaired of being able to say much about it, but fortunately Dr. Weibel came along and he gave us a model of the airways, a bit of an oversimplification, an idealized model, but extremely valuable. And one of the things that it showed us is that the cross-sectional area of each generation of airways increases greatly as we go towards the alveoli. And the upshot of that is that the forward velocity of the gas becomes so low in the periphery of the lung that diffusion is the most important mode of gas transfer. That explains why pollutants are deposited in the small airways, and that's very important in understanding the pathophysiology of diseases such as chronic bronchitis. We then looked at the various volumes of the lung, and we pointed out that although the dead space, the anatomic dead space, is extremely important, it's only about 5% of the total volume of lung. We also saw that the volume of gas in the alveoli is very large, about 3 liters typically, but the volume of blood in the pulmonary capillaries at any instant is extremely small, only about 70 mils. However, in spite of the great disparity between the ventilation, between the volumes of gas in the alveoli and in the volume of blood in the capillaries, the volumes per unit time of ventilation and blood flow are about the same, because the total alveolar ventilation in the example we showed was about 5 liters a minute. That's the same as the total blood flow, which is the cardiac output, about 5 liters a minute. So the ratio of ventilation to blood flow is normally about 1, and that's a ratio that we'll be talking about a lot when we come to consider pulmonary gas exchange. We then talked about the volumes of gas and how we measure them, and we showed that we can easily measure the tidal volume and the vital capacity with a spirometer. No problem there. However, we can't measure volumes such as the functional residual capacity or the residual volume, because the subject cannot breathe out, cannot expire all the gas in the lung. There's always some left at the end of a normal expiration. And so we have 2 ways of doing this. One is to use helium dilution, where the subject is connected to a spirometer that has helium in it, and he rebreathes, equilibrates the helium. Helium is essentially insoluble, and so we can calculate the volume of the lung from using that technique. The other technique was plethysmography, or using a body box, where the subject makes inspiratory efforts against a closed airway, and using Boyle's law, we're able to calculate the FRC. And that turns out to be a very important technique used in the pulmonary function laboratory. And finally, we talked about the measurements of ventilation, volumes per unit time. We pointed out that total ventilation is easy to measure. We just collect all the expired gas over a period of 5 minutes or so and measure its volume. Alveolar ventilation is more difficult to measure. One way is to subtract dead space ventilation from total ventilation. That gives us alveolar ventilation. But the problem there is that we don't know exactly what the dead space is, and therefore this is not an ideal way. And the best way by far is using the expired CO2. We're using the fact that all the CO2 and the expired gas comes from the alveolar compartment. And by working through those equations, we come up with the alveolar ventilation equation, which shows us that the alveolar ventilation, for example, is equal to the CO2 production divided by the PCO2, the partial pressure of CO2. There's a constant there as well, which we needn't bother about, and that equation becomes extremely important, as we'll see later on. So that's the end of our discussion of ventilation, and I look forward to seeing you next time.